Whispers of the Atlantic. The Atlantic whispers its secrets to those who listen carefully. And in the spring of 1945, those whispers carried stories of desperation, duty, and the dying gasps of the Third Reich's most feared weapon. Picture, if you will, the harbour at Kristiansand, Norway. Dawn breaks reluctantly over the fjord, casting long shadows across the concrete pens that house Germany's remaining U-boats. The air carries the salt tang of seawater mixed with diesel fuel and the metallic scent of steel. The massive concrete structures, built to withstand Allied bombing, now shelter fewer and fewer of the grey wolves that once terrorized Allied shipping lanes. Among these vessels lies U-977, a Type Vic submarine that would soon embark on perhaps the most mysterious voyage of the entire war. But to understand why this particular boat matters, why her story continues to fuel speculation and conspiracy theories decades later, we must first understand the desperate mathematics of Germany's underwater war in those final months. By April 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat arm was a shadow of its former self. The statistics tell a stark story. At the war's peak in 1942, German submarines had sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. But now the hunters had become the hunted. Advanced radar, improved depth charges, and the breaking of the Enigma code had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for German submarines. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crew had dropped to mere weeks. Young men, some barely out of their teens, found themselves sealed inside steel tubes, knowing that statistically they would never see home again. Yet still they sailed, driven by duty, fear, or perhaps simply because the alternative was unthinkable. Commander Heinz Schäfer understood these odds better than most. At 33, he was considered a veteran in a service where veterans were increasingly rare. His weathered face bore the pallor common to submariners, that distinctive lack of sunlight that marked men who spent months beneath the waves. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had kept him and his crew alive through 3 years of increasingly dangerous patrols. On this particular morning, as U-977 prepared for what would become her final mission, Schäfer stood on the conning tower, watching his crew make their last preparations. The ritual was familiar, had been repeated countless times in harbors across Nazi-occupied Europe. But something felt different this time. Perhaps it was the way the morning light seemed too bright, or the unusual quiet that had settled over the base. The crew of U-977 consisted of 48 men, each with his own story, his own reasons for being there. There was Klaus, the 19-year-old torpedo man from Bavaria who still kept a photograph of his sweetheart tucked inside his cap. Otto, the chief engineer, whose steady hands could coax life from machinery that should have failed weeks ago. And Werner, the radio operator, whose ability to decode Allied transmissions had saved their lives more than once. These men had learned to live in a space smaller than most people's living rooms. They had mastered the art of moving silently through cramped corridors, of sleeping while standing up, of rationing not just food and water, but hope itself. They knew each other's breathing patterns, could identify footsteps in complete darkness, and had developed that peculiar submarine telepathy that allowed them to work together without words. As the morning progressed, supplies were loaded through the narrow hatches. Not the abundant provisions of earlier war years, but carefully rationed stores that reflected Germany's dire situation. Ersatz coffee made from acorns, tinned meat of questionable origin, and fresh water that would have to last for months. Each item was logged, weighed, and secured against the violent motion that awaited them beneath the waves. The ammunition loading was particularly telling. Instead of the full complement of torpedoes that U-977 had once carried, only a handful remained. The torpedo rooms, once packed with the deadly fish that had terrorized Allied convoys, now held additional fuel tanks and supplies. This wasn't a hunting expedition. This was something else entirely. But what exactly was U-977's mission? Even today, more than 70 years later, the complete truth remains elusive. Official records speak of a routine patrol, a final attempt to disrupt Allied shipping in the South Atlantic. But other evidence suggests something far more intriguing and far more dangerous. In the weeks before departure, unusual modifications had been made to U-977's interior. Extra storage compartments had been welded into place. modifications that served no obvious military purpose. Strange visitors had come aboard during the night, men in civilian clothes who spoke in hushed tones with Commander Schaffer. And most mysteriously, several crew members had been replaced at the last minute with men whose backgrounds were unconventional. The intelligence picture that spring was fragmentary but deeply troubling for anyone paying attention. Allied codebreakers had intercepted references to something called Operation Bernhard, a plan that seemed to involve high-ranking Nazi officials and substantial resources. Other intercepts mentioned Axion Feuerland, Fireland, a codename that appeared in documents related to South America. What the Allies didn't fully grasp at the time was the extent of Nazi preparations for what they euphemistically called the aftermath. While Hitler raged in his Berlin bunker about miracle weapons and final victories, more pragmatic minds within the Nazi hierarchy were making very different preparations. Swiss bank accounts were being established, false identities prepared, and escape routes carefully planned. South America, particularly Argentina, had long been a destination for German emigrants. The large German communities in Buenos Aires and other cities provided perfect cover for those seeking to disappear. And the vast, sparsely populated regions of Patagonia offered isolation that could hide almost anything, or anyone. As U-977 prepared to slip her moorings that April morning, she carried more than just her official crew and supplies. In her modified compartments lay documents, gold, and quite possibly passengers whose names would never appear on any official manifest. The submarine that had once hunted Allied merchant ships was about to become something entirely different, a transport vessel for secrets that some believed could reshape the post-war world. The departure itself was unremarkable. U-977 slipped away from Kristiansand just after midnight, her diesel engines barely audible above the lap of waves against the harbour walls. No fanfare, no ceremonial send-off, just another grey shape disappearing into the darkness of the North Sea. But as the Norwegian coast faded into the pre-dawn gloom, those aboard U-977 knew they were embarking on something unprecedented. This wasn't just another patrol. It was a journey into the unknown, carrying secrets that would fuel conspiracy theories and speculation for generations to come. The Atlantic stretched before them, vast, dark, and full of dangers both known and imagined. Allied hunter-killer groups prowled the shipping lanes, aircraft with improved radar swept the seas, and the ever-present threat of depth charges waited for any submarine unlucky enough to be detected. Yet U-977 pressed on, following a course that would take her far from the traditional hunting grounds of the North Atlantic. South, always south, toward waters where few German submarines had ventured, toward a destination that remained classified long after the war's end. What drove these men to undertake such a perilous journey? Was it simple military duty, or something far more complex? The answer lies not just in official records and naval archives, but in the personal stories of those who lived through those final, desperate months of the Third Reich. Men who found themselves caught between loyalty and survival, between orders and conscience. As we follow U-977 on her mysterious final voyage, we'll uncover not just the technical details of submarine warfare, but the human drama that played out in the cramped confines of a steel tube beneath the waves. The story of men pushed to their limits, of secrets that governments preferred to keep buried, and of a journey that would end not in glory, but in one of the most puzzling surrenders of the entire war. The Atlantic keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, for those who listen carefully, the whispers become clear enough to understand. And beneath the surface, the waters of the Norwegian Sea accepted U-977 like an old friend welcoming home a weary traveler. As the submarine descended beneath the surface, the last traces of April sunlight faded into memory, replaced by the familiar blue-green twilight of the deep. Commander Schaffer moved through the narrow corridors with practiced ease, his footsteps silent on the metal decking. Behind him, the conning tower hatch sealed with a decisive clang, the sound that separated his crew from the world above. From this moment forward, they existed in their own universe, a world of gauges and valves, of whispered orders and mechanical rhythms. The transformation was immediate and complete. The submarine's hull groaned softly as water pressure increased, a sound that might unnerve a landlubber but served as a lullaby to these veteran submariners. They were home now, in the embrace of the deep Atlantic, where surface storms couldn't reach them and enemy aircraft couldn't spot them. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Klaus Brenner ran his weathered hands along the diesel housings, feeling for vibrations that shouldn't be there. At 52, Brenner was older than most of his crewmates, old enough to remember when U-boats were experimental curiosities rather than the backbone of Germany's naval strategy. His grey hair was cropped short, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of a man who understood that machines, like people, had moods and personalities. "She's running smooth as silk," he murmured to his assistant, a young machinist named Weber who still jumped at every unusual sound. "Listen to that purr. This old girl knows she's heading somewhere special." The engine room was Brenner's cathedral. Every pipe, every valve, every gauge told him a story. The temperature readings spoke of metal expanding and contracting in perfect harmony. The oil pressure indicators revealed the health of bearings and pistons working in synchronized precision. The vibration patterns through the deck plates told him which components were happy and which needed attention. But tonight, something felt different. Not wrong, just different. There was an extra tension in the air, a sense that this patrol carried weight beyond the ordinary. Brenner had served on 7 U-boats during his career, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. The cargo they'd loaded in Bergen, those sealed containers that required such careful handling, they weren't standard torpedo components or spare parts. 3 compartments forward, radio operator Friedrich Langer hunched over his equipment in the communications room. At 28, Langer possessed the kind of precise technical mind that made him invaluable to submarine operations. His fingers moved across the radio controls with the delicacy of a pianist, adjusting frequencies and monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum for any signs of enemy transmissions. The radio room was perhaps the most cramped space on the entire submarine, barely large enough for one man and his equipment. Lang sat surrounded by dials, switches, and meters that glowed softly in the dim lighting. The air smelled of heated vacuum tubes and the ozone scent of electrical equipment working at peak efficiency. Through his headphones, Langer could hear the ocean's electronic voice, static from distant thunderstorms, the faint pulse of navigation beacons, the occasional coded transmission from other German vessels scattered across the Atlantic. But he was listening for something specific tonight, a particular frequency that command had instructed him to monitor without explanation. The submarine's interior settled into its familiar rhythm as the crew adjusted to underwater routine. Condensation began forming on the cold metal surfaces, tiny droplets that would eventually find their way to the bilges below. The air recycling system hummed quietly, processing and reprocessing the same atmosphere that 43 men would share for the weeks ahead. In the torpedo room, sailors checked and rechecked their deadly cargo. But tonight, 4 of the usual torpedo racks held something different, those mysterious containers from Bergen. They were roughly the same size as torpedo warheads, but clearly much lighter. Whatever they contained, it wasn't explosive. The containers bore no markings, except for small serial numbers stenciled in black paint. Petty Officer Hans Müller, responsible for the torpedo room's organization, had tried to lift one of the containers during loading. His estimate: perhaps 60 kilograms each, too light for gold, too heavy for documents. The mystery gnawed at him, but 20 years of naval service had taught him when not to ask questions. Commander Schäfer made his way to the navigation station where charts of the South Atlantic lay spread across the plotting table. The route they would follow was already marked in pencil, a careful path that would take them far from the usual shipping lanes and patrol areas. Their destination remained classified, known only to Schäfer himself, but the general direction was clear: southwest toward the coast of Argentina. The submarine's motion changed subtly as they reached cruising depth. The gentle rolling motion of surface travel gave way to the steady, purposeful glide of a vessel in its natural element. U-977 was designed for this, built to slip through the ocean depths like a mechanical whale, silent and deadly. In the galley, Cook Sergeant Otto Richter prepared the evening meal from their carefully rationed supplies. Fresh bread, a luxury that would disappear within days as their stores of flour were consumed and not replenished. After that, it would be hardtack and preserved foods, the monotonous diet that sustained submarine crews on extended patrols. But Richter took pride in his work. understanding that good food was crucial for crew morale during the long weeks underwater. He'd learned to create surprisingly varied meals from limited ingredients, and his coffee, brewed strong enough to wake the dead, was legendary throughout the U-boat fleet. The sounds of the submarine created their own symphony, the steady thrum of electric motors, the whisper of air through ventilation ducts, the distant ping of sonar equipment painting acoustic pictures of the ocean ahead. Occasionally, the hull would creak as pressure changes affected the metal structure, but these sounds were reassuring rather than alarming. They meant the submarine was doing what it was designed to do. Young Weber, the machinist's assistant, was still learning to interpret these sounds. Every unusual noise made him tense, wondering if it signaled some mechanical failure that could doom them all. But Chief Engineer Brenner had a talent for reading his men as accurately as he read his machines. "Relax, son," Brenner said quietly, not looking up from his gauges. "She's talking to us, telling us she's healthy and ready for whatever lies ahead. When you've been down here as long as I have, you'll understand that silence is what you should fear, not these honest working sounds." The submarine continued its descent into the depths of the Atlantic, carrying its crew and mysterious cargo toward a destination that remained hidden in classified orders. Behind them, the surface world continued its desperate struggle. But here, in this mechanical cocoon, time seemed suspended. They existed now in a realm where the only reality was the gentle vibration of engines, the soft glow of instrument panels, and the knowledge that they were part of something larger, something that would soon become another chapter in the ocean's vast collection of secrets. The deep Atlantic welcomed them with its ancient patience, ready to guard whatever secrets they carried into its dark embrace. Echoes in the deep. The deep Atlantic welcomed them with its ancient patience, ready to guard whatever secrets they carried into its dark embrace. 3 days into their journey, the rhythm of the deep had become their world. The crew moved through their routines with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to live in harmony with their metal environment. Yet beneath this surface calm, an undercurrent of tension persisted, the knowledge that they were no longer simply submariners but carriers of something precious and unknown. Radio operator Klaus Langer sat hunched over his equipment in the communications compartment, his practiced ear tuned to the subtle variations in the acoustic landscape around them. The hydrophones painted an invisible picture of their surroundings. The distant groan of shifting currents, the occasional click of marine life, the vast emptiness that stretched in all directions. But today, something was different. He adjusted the sensitive dials with fingers that had learned to read the ocean's voice through metal and wire. There, faint but unmistakable, the rhythmic thrumming of multiple propellers cutting through water far above them. Langer's pulse quickened as he fine-tuned the equipment, isolating the sounds, counting the distinct signatures. His training told him what his heart hoped to deny. "Contact bearing 270, he called softly to the control room, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. "Multiple vessels, appears to be a convoy." Commander Schaefer appeared at his shoulder with the silent efficiency that had made him legendary among his crew. The older man's presence brought both comfort and gravity to the moment. Together, they listened to the distant symphony of Allied shipping, the deep bass notes of cargo vessels, the higher-pitched whine of escort destroyers, the complex harmony of a war machine in motion. "How many?" Schaefer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Langer closed his eyes, letting his trained senses pass the acoustic information. "At least 12 merchantmen. Possibly more. 4 escort vessels. They're maintaining standard convoy formation, bearing northwest." The commander nodded slowly, his mind already calculating distances, speeds, approach vectors. But there was something different in his manner today, a hesitation that Langer had never observed before. The radio operator glanced at his superior, noting the way Schaeffer's fingers drummed silently against the bulkhead, the slight furrow in his brow. "Sir," Langer ventured quietly. Schaeffer seemed to shake himself from some internal debate. "Continue monitoring, plot their course and speed." But he paused, and in that pause Lang sensed the weight of their secret mission pressing down upon them all. "Maintain current depth and heading. We observe only." The words hung in the recycled air of the compartment like an unspoken question. In the early days of the war, such a contact would have meant immediate action. The careful stalking, the precise calculations, the deadly dance of hunter and prey. But these were not the early days, and this was not an ordinary patrol. Word of the contact spread through the boat with the invisible speed of shared tension. In the engine room, Chief Brenner felt it in the subtle change in his men's movements. The way they checked their gauges with extra attention, the way conversations dropped to whispers. The great diesel engines continued their steady rhythm, but the men who tended them moved with the heightened awareness of predators who had caught a scent. Forward in the torpedo compartment, the crew went through the motions of readiness, checking tube pressures, verifying firing solutions, maintaining the deadly efficiency that had kept them alive through countless encounters. Yet there was an underlying confusion in their actions. They prepared for battle while sensing that battle might not come, a strange limbo that left them suspended between action and inaction. Young Seaman Fisher found himself gripping the torpedo loading mechanism with white knuckles, his imagination painting pictures of the convoy above them. Merchant sailors going about their duties, unaware of the steel predator gliding through the depths below. He thought of his own merchant marine uncle, somewhere on the North Sea routes, and felt the familiar knot of conflicting loyalties that had become the burden of his generation. "Easy, lad," whispered Petty Officer Krause, placing a steadying hand on Fisher's shoulder. "We follow orders, that's all any of us can do." But what were their orders exactly, Fisher wondered. The official mission briefing had been deliberately vague. Proceed to designated coordinates, maintain radio silence, deliver passengers and cargo as instructed. Nothing about engaging enemy shipping. Nothing about the aggressive tactics that had once made the U-boat fleet the terror of the Atlantic. In the control room, Commander Scheffer stood before the plotting table, his experienced hands tracing invisible courses across the chart. The convoy's projected path intersected their own route at an angle that would provide multiple attack opportunities. In the old days, it would have been a gift, a perfect setup for the kind of coordinated attack that had sent dozens of Allied vessels to the bottom. But the sealed orders in his safe spoke of different priorities now. The war was ending. Everyone knew it, though few dared speak it aloud. The Reich's grand ambitions were crumbling under the weight of reality, and men like Scheffer found themselves caught between duty and pragmatism, between the warrior's instincts and the survivor's wisdom. "Range to convoy?" he asked quietly. 8,000 meters and closing slowly, came the reply from the navigation station. "They're maintaining course. No indication they've detected us." Scheffer nodded, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that had served him throughout his naval career. "All stop," he ordered. "Silent running. We let them pass." The command rippled through the boat like a stone dropped in still water. The great engines fell silent, leaving only the whisper of battery-powered systems and the gentle creak of the hull adjusting to water pressure. U-977 became a ghost in the deep, present but invisible, deadly but restrained. Radio operator Lang continued his vigil, tracking the convoy's progress through the acoustic shadows of the deep ocean. He listened as the distant propeller sounds grew stronger, then gradually began to fade as the Allied ships passed beyond their position. Each minute felt like an hour, each heartbeat loud in the unnatural silence of their steel sanctuary. The crew waited in their various stations, each man alone with his thoughts, yet bound together by their shared fate. They were no longer the hunters they had once been, no longer the aggressive wolves of the Atlantic pack. They had become something else, carriers of secrets, guardians of mysteries, passengers on a journey whose destination remained hidden even from themselves. As the last echoes of the convoy faded into the ocean's vast silence, Commander Scheffer allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. They had passed their first test, not of courage or skill, but of restraint and discipline. The war that had shaped them was ending, but their mission, whatever it truly was, continued. "Resume course and speed," he ordered quietly. "Maintain depth." The engines hummed back to life, and U-977 continued its mysterious journey southward, carrying its secrets deeper into the Atlantic's patient embrace. Above them, the convoy sailed on toward its own unknown fate, unaware of how close they had come to an encounter that never happened, a battle that was never fought in a war that was already ending in all but name. In the radio compartment, Klaus Langer removed his headphones and rubbed his tired ears. The ocean had returned to its normal whispers, the endless conversation of currents and creatures that had preceded human conflict and would continue long after it ended. But he knew that somewhere in those depths, other boats were still hunting, still fighting the war that refused to die quietly. For now, though, they were alone again, suspended between surface and seabed, between past and future, carrying their burden of secrets toward whatever destiny awaited them in the deep waters ahead, the weight of silence. The silence that followed was different from the mechanical quiet they had grown accustomed to. This was the silence of the deep, the profound hush that exists only in the ocean's forgotten places, where sunlight has never touched and where the weight of water above presses down like the accumulated years of human memory. Sheffer had ordered them deeper after the convoy passed, much deeper than their usual patrol depths. The pressure gauges told a story of descent that made even the most experienced crew members glance at each other with quiet concern. At 300 meters, the hull began its familiar groaning, the steel speaking in tongues that only submariners understood. But they continued down. 400 meters, Herr Callot, Brenner reported softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Even in the depths, they maintained the discipline of silence, as if the ocean itself might betray their position to enemies far above. The commander stood motionless beside the periscope housing, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that had become second nature over these long months of command. But his mind was elsewhere, drifting through memories that seemed to surface unbidden in these moments of absolute quiet. He remembered mornings in Hamburg, before the war, when his greatest concern had been the tide tables for his father's fishing boats. The Schaffer family had worked these waters for generations, though never at such depths, never with such purpose. His father had taught him to read the ocean's moods, the subtle changes in current and temperature that spoke of weather systems hundreds of kilometers away. The sea remembers everything, his father had said during one of their early morning departures. Every storm, every calm, every boat that has passed this way. You must learn to listen to what it tells you. Now, suspended in the Atlantic's crushing embrace, Scheffer wondered what memories this particular patch of ocean held. How many ships had passed overhead in the centuries before submarines made the depths their hunting ground? How many storms had churned these waters while he was still a boy, learning to mend nets and read the wind? The crew moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, but he could sense the underlying tension. They were deeper than regulations recommended, deeper than most of them had ever been. The hull's protests grew more frequent, sharp metallic sounds that seemed to echo through their bones. "Pressure holding steady," reported the diving officer, though his voice carried the weight of careful attention. Every gauge, every seal, every weld was being tested by forces that could crush them in an instant if anything failed. Lang sat hunched over his radio equipment, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening to frequencies that carried only static at this depth. But Scheffer had ordered him to maintain his watch, to listen for any transmission that might penetrate the layers of water above them. The radio operator's face showed the strain of concentration, searching for signals in an ocean of electronic silence. Time moved differently in the deep, without the rhythm of surface watches, without the changing light that filtered down from above. The hours seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Schaefer found himself remembering his wedding day. The way sunlight had streamed through the church windows in Bremen, casting patterns on the stone floor that shifted with the passing clouds. Ingrid had worn her grandmother's dress, ivory silk that caught the light like foam on a gentle wave. She had smiled when he told her that, laughing at his sailor's way of seeing the world in terms of wind and water. "Everything reminds you of the sea," she had said, but not unkindly. Where was she now? The question haunted him in these quiet moments. His last letter from home had been months ago. Before this mission began, before they had loaded their mysterious cargo and set course for waters that appeared on no standard charts. The war had scattered families like seeds on the wind, and he had no way of knowing where that wind had carried the people he loved. "Herr Callot," Brenner's voice cut gently through his reverie. "We're approaching maximum safe depth for extended operations." Scheffer nodded, returning his attention to the present. The chief engineer was right, of course. They could go deeper still, but each additional meter increased the risk exponentially. And they had too far yet to travel, too important a mission to complete. "Level off here," he ordered quietly. "All stop, silent running procedures." The submarine's engines fell silent, leaving only the essential systems humming at minimum power. They would drift now, suspended in the ocean's embrace like a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. Above them, the war continued its relentless march toward whatever conclusion awaited. Below them, the ocean floor stretched away into darkness that no human eye had ever penetrated. In this space between worlds, Sheffer allowed himself to remember the smell of his mother's kitchen, bread baking on Sunday mornings while his father prepared the boats for another week at sea. He remembered the sound of gulls calling over Hamburg's harbor and the way morning mist would rise from the water like the breath of sleeping giants. Such memories felt precious now, fragile things that might shatter if examined too closely. The war had taught him that the past was a luxury, something to be rationed carefully like fuel or fresh water. But in the deep silence, surrounded by men who trusted him to bring them safely through whatever lay ahead, he found himself holding these fragments of his former life like talismans against the darkness. The crew settled into the rhythm of deep patrol, minimal movement, whispered communications, constant vigilance. Each man understood that their survival depended not just on their equipment and training, but on their ability to become part of the ocean itself, to match its patience, its silence, its vast indifference to human urgency. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost its conventional meaning in this place where day and night held no dominion. Sheffer remained at his post, listening to the submarine's quiet breathing, feeling through the deck plates the subtle currents that moved through the deep Atlantic, like the circulation of some vast, slow heart. Somewhere far above, he knew, the surface world continued its ancient dance with wind and weather. Ships moved along their prescribed routes, carrying cargo and passengers toward destinations marked on charts and timetables. But here, in the profound depths, such human constructs seemed as distant as the stars. They were alone now in the truest sense, separated from the surface world by hundreds of meters of crushing water, carrying secrets that might never see daylight, following orders that led toward an uncertain future. Yet in this isolation, Schaefer found an unexpected peace, the deep calm that comes only to those who have learned to trust in forces larger than themselves. The ocean held them now in its ancient embrace, and they would remain here in the silence until it was safe to rise again toward the distant light. Ghostly encounters. Hours passed in the depths, marked only by the gentle hum of recycled air and the soft whisper of instruments monitoring their descent into the ocean's most secret places. Commander Schaefer moved through the narrow corridors like a ghost himself, checking gauges, observing his men, maintaining the careful balance that kept them alive in this underwater world. It was Chief Engineer Brenner who first noticed the anomaly on the depth sounder, a shadow on the ocean floor that shouldn't have been there. "Commander," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper in the hushed atmosphere of the control room. "Something on the bottom, bearing 270. Sheffer studied the readings, his experienced eyes interpreting the electronic echoes that painted pictures of the unseen world below. The signature was unmistakable, the broken outline of a ship, resting on the abyssal plain nearly 4,000 meters beneath them. "Take us down for a closer look," he ordered quietly. Dead slow, minimum disturbance. The U-boat descended through layers of increasingly cold water, past the thermoclines where temperature gradients bent sound waves into strange patterns, down toward the eternal darkness where no sunlight had ever penetrated. Here, in the deepest places of the Atlantic, the pressure would crush a human body in milliseconds. Yet somehow the ocean seemed more peaceful than threatening. As they approached the seabed, their sonar painted a clearer picture of what lay below. A merchant vessel, perhaps 10,000 tons, broken in half and scattered across the sandy bottom. Her back had been snapped by torpedo strikes, her cargo holds split open like wounds, spilling their contents into the abyss. The twisted remains of her superstructure reached upward like skeletal fingers, a monument to violence in this place of eternal silence. "British Registry," whispered Navigation Officer Mueller, consulting his recognition manuals. "Looks like the SS Britannic Star, reported lost with all hands in February 1943. Sheffer felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. February 1943. He remembered that convoy action. U-402 had claimed credit for this kill, radioing Berlin about their successful attack on the merchant fleet. At the time, it had been just another entry in the war diary. Tonnage sunk, mission accomplished, return to base for congratulations and fresh torpedoes. But here, in the profound quiet of the deep ocean, the reality looked different. This wasn't tonnage. This was someone's final resting place. The Britannic Star had carried more than cargo. She had carried men who wrote letters to wives they would never see again, who kept photographs of children in their wallet pockets, who dreamed of shore leave and home-cooked meals and the simple pleasure of solid ground beneath their feet. "How many souls aboard?" Schäfer asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Manifest shows 47 crew, plus 8 passengers," Muller replied. No survivors reported. 55 lives ended in the space of minutes by explosions that turned their world into chaos and terror and crushing water. 55 men who had descended into this darkness not by choice, but by the brutal mathematics of war. The same mathematics that had guided U-boat commanders to their hunting grounds, that had calculated intercept courses and torpedo spreads with mechanical precision. The U-977 drifted slowly over the wreckage, her own shadow passing across the broken hull like a funeral shroud. In the eerie glow of their external lights, they could see details that spoke of the ship's final moments. Lifeboats still secured in their davits, never launched. Bridge windows blown inward by the force of detonation. Personal effects scattered across the deck plating, now home to strange deep-sea creatures that had never known the warmth of sunlight. "Sir," radio operator Lang spoke softly from his station, "I'm picking up something. Very faint, almost like—" He paused, adjusting his headphones, fine-tuning the sensitive receivers that could detect the smallest electrical disturbances in the water around them. "It's probably nothing, just the metal hull settling, thermal expansion." But Schäfer saw the uncertainty in the young man's eyes. In the deep ocean, experienced submariners learned to trust their instincts about things that couldn't quite be explained. The sea held mysteries that no amount of technical training could fully illuminate. Currents that behaved strangely around wreckage, acoustic shadows that seemed to carry echoes of the past, electromagnetic fields that fluctuated without apparent cause. "What does it sound like?" Schäfer asked gently. Langer hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to voice something that might sound foolish. "Like voices, sir. Very distant. Like people calling out across a great distance." "But that's impossible. The water pressure alone." The commander nodded thoughtfully. He had heard similar reports from other U-boat crews who had encountered wreckage in the deep places of the Atlantic. Science might dismiss such things as the product of stress and isolation, the mind's attempt to make sense of unfamiliar sounds in an alien environment. But Schäfer had learned that the ocean held truths that couldn't be measured by instruments or explained in technical manuals. Perhaps the voices were real. The final radio transmissions of dying ships, somehow trapped in the metallic structures below, playing back endlessly in frequencies only the most sensitive equipment could detect. Perhaps they were merely the sounds of metal cooling and contracting in the eternal cold of the abyss. Or perhaps they were something else entirely. The memory of human presence lingering in places where courage and fear and love had burned brightest in those final moments before the darkness claimed everything. "We'll maintain position here for a while," Schäfer decided. "Silent running, minimal power. Let the men rest." It seemed appropriate somehow to pause in their own mysterious mission and acknowledge the presence of those who had passed this way before them. The Britannic Star had been carrying her own secrets when she died. Cargo manifests that listed steel and grain but might have concealed intelligence documents or gold or strategic materials. Her passengers had been traveling toward their own uncertain destinations, carrying their own hopes and fears and unfinished business. Now they rested together in the democracy of the deep, where nationality and allegiance meant nothing, where British merchant sailors and German U-boat crews would someday lie side by side in the same eternal silence, their war forgotten by the creatures that made homes in their bones. The hours passed quietly as U-977 maintained her vigil over the wreckage. The crew moved through their routines with unusual reverence, speaking in whispers, checking their equipment with extra care. Even the youngest sailors seemed to sense that they were in the presence of something sacred, a place where the ocean had claimed its own and transformed violence into peace. Commander Sheffer found himself thinking about the families who had never learned what happened to the Britannic Star. Wives who had waited for letters that never came, children who had watched for ships that never appeared on the horizon, parents who had grown old, wondering whether their sons had died quickly or had suffered in the cold Atlantic darkness. The war would end soon. Perhaps it had already ended, while they traveled in radio silence toward their unknown destination. When it did, there would be investigations and tribunals and attempts to assign blame for all the destruction. But here, in the deepest places of the ocean, such judgments seemed impossibly distant and irrelevant. Here, there was only the eternal conversation between memory and forgetting, between the human need to remember those who had passed and the ocean's patient work of transforming all things into peace. Had a fading signal. The first sign came as a whisper through the static, a fragment of transmission that radio operator Lang almost dismissed as atmospheric interference. He adjusted his headphones and fine-tuned the frequency, his weathered fingers moving across the dials with practiced precision. There it was again. Fainter now, but unmistakable. A coded message from Kriegsmarine headquarters, its signal strength suggesting it had traveled far across the turbulent Atlantic to reach them in their deep sanctuary. Langer's expression shifted as he decoded the transmission. His usual steady demeanor gave way to something approaching disbelief. He checked the message twice, then a third time, before rising slowly from his station and making his way through the narrow corridor toward the commander's quarters. Commander Sheffer looked up from his charts as Langer entered, noting immediately the unusual tension in his radio operator's bearing. In the cramped confines of the U-boat, such subtle changes in mood traveled quickly through the crew, like ripples across still water. "Herr Commandant," Langer said quietly, extending the decoded message. "Priority transmission from headquarters." Sheffer took the paper and read it in silence. The words seemed to blur before his eyes, their meaning almost too large to comprehend. Unconditional surrender negotiations, cessation of hostilities, orders to surface and report to Allied authorities. He read it again, more slowly this time. The message was fragmentary, clearly transmitted under difficult circumstances. But its essential meaning was unmistakable. After nearly 6 years of warfare, the Reich was preparing to lay down its arms. "When did this come through?" Sheffer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 14 minutes ago, sir. The signal was very weak. I've been trying to raise headquarters for confirmation, but—" Langer shook his head. "Nothing but static now." Sheffer folded the message carefully and placed it on his small desk. Through the hull of the submarine, he could hear the familiar sounds of the deep ocean, the gentle creaking of metal under pressure, the distant hum of the electric motors, the soft breathing of 56 men who still believed they were fighting a war that might already be over. "Thank you, Lang. Continue monitoring all frequencies. If you receive anything else—" He paused, searching for words that seemed adequate to the moment. "Bring it to me immediately." Alone in his quarters, Sheffer stared at the message until the words seemed to lose their meaning entirely. Surrender. The concept felt foreign after so many months of running silent, of carrying their mysterious cargo toward an unknown destination in the South Atlantic. He thought of the sealed orders locked in his safe, instructions that had seemed so vital when they departed Norway just weeks ago. Were those orders still valid? Did their secret mission still matter in a world where the war itself might be ending? The weight of command had never felt heavier. In the darkness of the ocean depths, cut off from reliable communication with the surface world, he faced a decision that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every man under his command. Through the thin bulkhead, he could hear Chief Engineer Brenner making his rounds, checking pressure gauges, monitoring the battery levels, maintaining the delicate balance that kept them alive in this hostile environment. Brenner and his men continued their work with the same dedication they had shown for months, unaware that the war they served might already be slipping into history. Sheffer rose and made his way to the control room, where the familiar routine of submarine operations continued undisturbed. The plainsmen maintained their depth with subtle adjustments. The sonar operator listened for threats that might no longer exist. The navigator plotted their course toward coordinates that might no longer have meaning. Depth holding steady at 200 meters, reported the duty officer. All systems nominal. Sheffer nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with questions that had no clear answers. If the war was truly ending, what did that mean for their mission? What did it mean for the civilians they carried? The scientists and officials who had boarded in such secrecy back in Norway? He thought of the convoy they had allowed to pass unharmed just days earlier. At the time, it had seemed like a betrayal of their warriors' code, a necessary sacrifice for the greater importance of their secret cargo. Now he wondered if it had been an unconscious recognition that the time for such violence was already passing. The ocean around them remained unchanged, vast and patient and indifferent to human conflict. In its depths, the distinction between victory and defeat seemed almost meaningless. There was only survival, only the endless challenge of maintaining life in a realm that was never meant for human habitation. Hours passed in this strange limbo. Langer continued his vigil at the radio, occasionally catching fragments of distant transmissions, pieces of a larger conversation that remained frustratingly incomplete. The signals seemed to fade even as he listened, as if the world above was slowly moving beyond their reach. "Still nothing coherent, sir," he reported during one of Sheffer's visits to the radio compartment. "I'm picking up what might be Allied transmissions, but they're too distant to decode properly." Sheffer studied the radio equipment as if it might reveal some hidden truth. These machines had been their lifeline to the surface world, their connection to the war that had given their lives meaning and purpose. Now they offered only silence and uncertainty. "Keep trying," he said finally. "If the war is truly ending, we need to know." But even as he spoke the words, Sheffer wondered if knowing would make their situation any clearer. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest land, carrying passengers and cargo whose importance might have vanished with the Reich's surrender. They had fuel enough to continue their journey south, or to surface and seek out Allied vessels willing to accept their surrender. The choice seemed impossible. To continue their mission might be meaningless, or it might be the most important thing they could do. To surrender might be the honorable course, or it might be a betrayal of those who had entrusted them with secrets they barely understood. In the end, Sheffer realized they were truly alone now, cut off from the chain of command that had guided their actions. Isolated in the vast darkness of the Atlantic, they had become a small world unto themselves. 56 men and their mysterious passengers, drifting between a past that might be ending and a future that remained unwritten. The ocean pressed against their hull with patient persistence, reminding them that regardless of human wars and surrenders, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. They were visitors in this deep realm, temporary intruders whose survival depended on their ability to work together, to maintain their fragile vessel, to navigate by instruments and instinct through waters that offered no forgiveness for error. As the hours stretched toward an uncertain dawn somewhere far above, U-977 continued its southward journey, carrying its secrets and its questions deeper into the South Atlantic, where the answers to their dilemma might finally reveal themselves. Surrender. The dawn brought clarity in ways Sheffer had not expected. As the first pale light filtered down through the water above them, he found himself studying the faces of his men, really looking at them for perhaps the first time in weeks. Brenner, methodically checking his gauges with the same precision he'd shown since their departure from Norway. Lang hunched over his radio equipment, still hoping for clearer signals from a world that seemed increasingly distant. The young seamen, barely old enough to shave, going about their duties with quiet professionalism, despite the uncertainty that hung over them all like morning fog. The decision, when it crystallized in his mind, felt less like a choice and more like recognition, an acknowledgement of something that had been building for days beneath the surface of his consciousness. They were no longer warriors carrying out a mission for the Reich. They were simply men, far from home, responsible for each other's lives in a war that was ending, whether they participated in its conclusion or not. "Chief," Sheffer called softly to Brenner, "prepare to surface." The words carried through the control room with unusual weight. Conversation stopped. The steady rhythm of their underwater existence seemed to pause, waiting. Brenner approached, his weathered face showing no surprise. "Sir, are we making contact?" "We're going home, Chief, or as close to home as we can manage." The process of surfacing felt different this time, deliberate rather than tactical, ceremonial rather than operational. The ballast tanks emptied with their familiar rush of compressed air. But the sound seemed softer somehow, less urgent. U-977 began her slow ascent from the depths where she had spent so many hours in contemplation. As they rose through the layers of Atlantic water, Sheffer found himself thinking not of the mysterious cargo in their aft compartments or the passengers whose identities remained known only to him, but of the simple miracle of their survival. 43 men had descended into these waters weeks ago, and 43 men would surface together. A small victory in itself, perhaps the only victory that truly mattered now. The periscope broke the surface first, revealing a world transformed by morning light. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface painted in shades of gold and silver by the rising sun. No ships visible on the horizon, no immediate threat or salvation, just the vast democracy of open water that recognized no flags, no allegiances, only the eternal relationship between wind and wave. "Surface," Sheffer commanded. U-977 breached like some ancient sea creature returning to breathe. Water cascaded from her conning tower as she settled into her natural rhythm with the swells. The hatch opened with a metallic clang that seemed to announce their return to the world of air and light and infinite sky. Sheffer climbed to the bridge, feeling the Atlantic breeze on his face for the first time in days. The sensation was overwhelming. Not just the physical relief of unlimited air and space, but the psychological impact of emergence from their steel cocoon into a world that continued to exist, continued to offer possibilities beyond the narrow confines of duty and mission. Below, he could hear his crew moving with renewed energy. The surfaced submarine felt different, more alive somehow, connected once again to the natural rhythms that their underwater existence had temporarily suspended. The diesel engines would soon replace the electric motors, providing the power they needed for whatever journey lay ahead. Langer appeared at the bridge, radio headset still around his neck. "Sir, I'm receiving clearer transmissions now. Allied frequencies are. They're broadcasting surrender instructions. Protocols for German naval units." Sheffer nodded, unsurprised. The fragments they had received over the past days had painted a clear enough picture for those willing to read the signs. The war was ending, had perhaps already ended in all but the most formal sense. "Very well, begin transmitting our position and intentions, standard surrender protocols." The words felt strange in his mouth, but not bitter. There was relief in them and something approaching peace. They had carried their secrets across thousands of miles of ocean, had fulfilled their duty to the extent that circumstances allowed. Now they would surrender those secrets along with themselves, trusting that history would judge their actions with the complexity they deserved. As Langer returned below to begin the delicate process of contacting Allied authorities, Sheffer remained on the bridge, watching the sun climb higher above the horizon. The ocean around them seemed infinite, indifferent to human conflict, offering the same challenges and the same beauty to all who ventured upon its surface. His crew emerged gradually onto the deck, moving with the careful precision of submariners, but also with something new. A lightness that came from knowing their war was ending, not in destruction, but in this quiet surrender to forces larger than themselves. They began the process of preparing their vessel for inspection, securing classified materials, ensuring that their surrender would proceed with the same professionalism they had brought to every other aspect of their service. The mysterious passengers remained below, their fate now intertwined with that of the crew. Whatever secrets they carried, whatever mission had brought them aboard U-977 would soon be revealed to Allied interrogators. The burden of those secrets, at least, would no longer rest solely on Sheffer's shoulders. As the morning progressed and their position was acknowledged by distant Allied commands, U-977 continued her gentle movement with the swells. No longer a weapon of war, but simply a vessel carrying men who had chosen survival and surrender over a final, futile gesture of defiance. Echoes of peace. The Atlantic swells rolled endlessly beneath an afternoon sun that painted the water in shades of gold and deepest blue. The same waters that had witnessed so much conflict now embracing U-977 with the gentle rhythm of eternal tides. The submarine's hull, scarred by months of war patrols, caught the light as she moved with the ocean's natural cadence. No longer fighting against the sea, but moving in harmony with currents that had flowed long before nations drew their battle lines. Commander Sheffer stood on the bridge, watching the horizon where sea met sky in an unbroken line of possibility. The radio chatter from Allied vessels had grown more routine now, coordinates exchanged, procedures discussed, the mundane details of surrender replacing the urgent codes of warfare. His crew moved about their duties with a quietness that spoke not of defeat, but of profound relief. Men who had carried the weight of impossible decisions now finding peace in the simple act of breathing salt air under an open sky. Below in the engine room, Chief Engineer Brenner ran his hands along the diesels that had carried them through countless dives and desperate hours. Machines that had hummed with the tension of war now settling into the steady rhythm of a journey towards safe harbor. The mysterious cargo that had defined their final mission remained sealed in its compartments, secrets that would soon pass into the hands of others, their burden lifted from shoulders that had carried them across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. Radio operator Lang monitored frequencies that no longer crackled with battle reports and emergency signals. Instead, the airwaves carried weather reports, shipping notices, and the ordinary communications of a world slowly remembering how to speak of things other than war. His logbooks, filled with the coded transmissions of desperate months, would soon become historical documents, records of men who had sailed into uncertainty and found their way to wisdom. The ocean itself seemed to exhale, releasing the tension of years when every ship that appeared on the horizon might bring death, when every dive might be the last, when the very act of surfacing required courage that few could understand. Now those same waters reflected clouds that drifted without urgency, wind patterns that spoke of weather rather than tactical advantage, currents that carried only the natural debris of tides rather than the wreckage of battle. As afternoon dissolved into evening, U-977 continued her passage through waters that held the memories of countless vessels, merchant ships that had carried the hopes of nations, warships that had sailed with the pride of their crews, submarines like themselves that had descended into darkness and silence. The ocean floor below remained a sacred archive, a library of human ambition and sacrifice written in steel and stone, where the stories of those who had sailed these waters would rest in eternal quiet. The mysteries of the deep would endure long after the last echoes of this war faded from memory, long after the strategic decisions and tactical calculations became footnotes in history books, long after the names of battles were memorized by students who could never fully comprehend the weight of those moments when ordinary men made extraordinary choices in the face of impossible circumstances. Commander Sheffer thought of the merchant ship they had discovered on the ocean floor, of the British sailors who had found their final rest in the deep, of the shared humanity that connected all who had answered the call of duty and sailed into waters where courage was measured not in victories, but in the simple determination to continue serving something larger than oneself. The sea held them all now, German and British, victor and vanquished, all equal in the democracy of salt water and eternal tides. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in colors that had inspired sailors since men first ventured beyond sight of land. And U-977 moved through those painted waters like a prayer made manifest, carrying her crew toward harbors where former enemies would extend the ancient courtesies that mariners had always shown to those who had survived the sea's testing, where the mysteries they carried would become part of the larger story of human endurance, and where the endless rhythm of waves against hull would finally sing not of war, but of the deeper peace that flows beneath all storms, connecting every shore to every other shore in the vast and forgiving embrace of waters that remember everything and judge nothing, carrying the dreams of nations and the hopes of individual hearts toward horizons that promise always the possibility of safe harbor and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled in the service of something greater than fear.